Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Actually, in the room we have good afternoon, but I'm sure there are some in the later time zones as well. Today, I think when I discussed it with Ashutosh, I think we were talking about as to how exactly to frame 6G or next G. And so my talk is primarily to motivate a discussion on whether 6G, the next generation, needs to be evolutionary or, for that matter, revolutionary, or what proportion of ideas should really be revolutionary if we're really talking about a new generation of wireless and network standards. This work was done actually with a number of my colleagues as we motivated and discussed around AT&T labs. So, you know how we can remove them?
Just click on the background. You can go in.
It goes to the next one.
Maybe you can stop it. And if you can try this, click on the three dots. You need to do stop thing and then start thing. Then it is looking. I did your path. I've been before. Hi. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. There you go.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for, and sorry for the interruption on that. So as we look at, and this question has been asked multiple times with every generation. I think we went through this exact discussion across various SDOs in terms of saying as to what exactly should really be there from 3G to 4G and 4G to 5G. And I have to say that from 4G to 5G, there were quite a few revolutionary ideas that got in. Obviously, we revamped completely the core architecture, and also there were quite a few other ideas that got into the radio access part as well, including the physical network design. But I think we have continued to stay with the OFDMA on the OFDMA track. So that is why it got thinking in terms of, okay, we can look at it traditionally, and some of the earlier speakers in the plenary had mentioned that yes, we could really look at this particular IMT advanced or IMT 2020 diagram and say that in each of these dimensions there could be an order of magnitude improvement, and that would be a normal thing that we would go about doing and define these incremental or even an order of magnitude more improvements in 6G. But when this particular model is defined, a lot of people 6G is related to only the physical layer, whereas a physical layer or radio access network in general, whereas what we need to really look at is holistically end-to-end as a service architecture as to what exactly is needed to provide a service to a consumer. And consumer, again, traditionally has been our retail consumers, but then when you look at a variety of other consumers that started coming into the play, especially we talk about enterprise consumers, the factory automation is taking place, and machine to machine. So all those have different needs, and we need to really look at some of those as well. So what we basically said was that we should really be looking at the key goals for the next generation network. Trustworthiness, and some of these, when you look at just the words, it seems that we have talked about it in 4G, in 5G, and now we are exactly repeating them in 6G. The question always is, have we achieved those in 5G? And should we really be looking at? So I would be arguing that no, I think we really need to rethink as to what the end-to-end architecture would look like, and then define based on the needs. So trustworthiness, security has been the most talked about every time we talk about it. But if we look at what 4G has done and what 5G has done, we've really looked at point to point. We still rely on the security gateways at various points in the network. Yes, in the RAN, we basically encrypt. Over the air, we encrypt. But beyond that, it is anybody's game. And then we say, okay, the application could do it at the SSL or something like that. But otherwise, there is no notion of privacy. For an end-to-end service, there's no notion of trust per se and reliability of what exactly we are transmitting over there. Similarly, efficiency and green, the second pillar. Now, if you look at what exactly has been our record until 5G for energy savings, we have come up with mechanisms where we say, okay, we would shut down a particular base station. Maybe we'd shut down some transmitters, okay? Or we could come up with certain other means to save energy. But apart from that, there's been very little systemic way of really defining the physical layer itself in terms of saying as to whether it is energy efficient or not. And then obviously we have moved to a great extent in the cloud where there are further knobs that we can play with in terms of energy efficiency, but it has not been as much effective. And what we really need to look at is how exactly can it be spectrally efficient and yet be clean. And we can read through this. Intelligence is, I would think, revolutionary. It would be one pillar which I think we've talked about it again. The first attempts that have been, again, if I say that SON was the first attempt that we made, nothing came about it in terms of 4G. We started talking about in 4G. In 5G, again, we have looked at it, but it has really not become a reality yet. And what we would really want in the next generation network be that it is intelligence is built in at every layer and across layers as well. So some of the first attempts actually, in fact, has been done in ORAN as they're defining, and we're talking about XApps and RApps, and obviously that may evolve as well in terms of how successful they become. But again, defining natively the PHY layer, the MAC layer, and others to have AI built in would be kind of revolutionary. So that is something that we should focus on rather than making these incremental changes. Massively scalable, I would say there we have made some strides. Again, cloudification is still being talked about, not in deployment, but at least in thought process in terms of, yes, we are really talking about VNS rather than PNS. But to achieve this massive scale, and a number of speakers prior to me had said that yes, the scale has to be massive. Someone said that by 2030, there'd be, 300 exabytes that would be transmitted across the network. Now that implies that yes, there has to be a massively scalable network, and we need to look at as to how exactly all those bits would get transmitted across end to end. So a lot of cloudification would have to be done at every level, and in fact, in the RAN itself, more and more cloudification is being thought of. It obviously has to be open because that is something ORAN has started, and it has seen that yes, there is a general acceptance within the marketplace. And service-centric. As I said, everything finally boils down to as to what service are we providing. We can feel extremely proud that yes, certain 5-layer features have been added, or certain specific features have been added into specific layers or domains. But I think it does not work unless and until we can provide successfully an end-to-end service. And that relies on, again, AI we talked about. We talked about these applications, but that implies that there's a huge amount of data ingestion that has to take place from the underlying network on which those algorithms are really good. So that needs to happen. So with those 6 goals, we would say there are 6 design drivers as well, 5 goals, and then 6 design drivers as well. And at the bottom, so we talked about the network drivers at the top, and we talk about the 6 use cases. And what are these? Some of these have been thought of in the context of 5G as well, but they haven't become a reality yet. In fact, if you think about URLLC, it's still has not been standardized to the fullest. But the first case is, it reminds us of what somebody would call as XR, AR, VR, all the combinations of those. But, and some would call it metaverse, and some would call it digital twins, and so on. But the idea being that yes, all those need to be accounted for by the network. Factory automation of various forms, and factory automation is just synonymous to, or just indicative of what type of automation would be required, is another use case. In the medicine, telemedicine and telesurgery has been talked about. Obviously, nobody talks about it in the context of 5G yet, but that would be something to really make it commonplace, would be an achievement. XR, VR, ubiquitous coverage is something that we all talk about all the time. And ubiquitous coverage is something that we have spoken about for a number of years, but it hasn't been achieved. And now finally, it would be the sensing. One thing that would be extremely revolutionary for 6G would be, instead of just being communication protocol, there should be sensing as well, whether it is high resolution sensing or low resolution sensing. But sensing, if it comes, that would be extremely useful. So with those 2 network drivers and the use cases being defined, then we can think of in each of those areas, radio interface, network architectures, and let's move over time, okay? Just tell me if I'm running out of time.
Okay, you've got it.
Okay. Just want to be cognizant of that. Radio interface, network architectures, component technologies, security and reliability. So all those become our design principles on which we would need to define the next generation wireless network. I'm consciously not saying wireless standard, or I'm not saying the air interface, but across the network. So about 2 minutes. 2 minutes? Okay. So I think I've we've listed a number of areas, and I wouldn't want to actually go through each of them. But as you would see, I would point to the second one, radio interface. Obviously, there are a lot of MIMO technologies that we can think of, and all these are new technologies that we'll have to really work on. And the interesting thing is that sometimes one would say that, yes, we are thinking about it, pitching it to 6G, but some of the low-hanging fruits would in fact be pulled over, and they most likely would get standardized in 5G Advanced. And so that is where the push and pull would come through. Some things that get proven early may get pulled into an earlier standard, but otherwise each of these would need to be worked at. For example, I always say that network MIMO has been talked about for now at least 15 to 20 years. Theoretically, it has been proven that yes, it does give you advantage in terms of total cell throughput. But has it become a reality? No. Why? Because obviously backhaul bandwidths were not there. Now that fiber is being laid, it is probably practical, at least to think, imagine that yes, such a thing could be possible. Not that it would get implemented in every deployment, but in some deployments at least, it is possible. And that is where we'll have to look at it. I would again draw your attention to service creation and management, which is again extremely important. All this becomes only a reality if we do have intent-based service orchestration and management. It may seem extremely vague a concept, but that is what would really lead us to, in fact, it is key to network slicing, dynamic network slicing, on-demand network slicing, and it would be extremely important for an efficient resource utilization, network resource utilization as well. So I'm just drawing some of them to draw your attention that each of these are extremely important research areas, and they need to be worked at. I've listed a few, and I would not cover all. I'm realizing that I would not cover all, but I think I'd point to this joint communication and sensing, which would be an extremely important way in which we could get some understanding of our localized environment. And if it could come for free, that would be even better. Similarly, seamless connectivity, AI and ML design across the board would be extremely useful. And I'd leave for the reader to read the rest of them. There are quite a few research areas in there. And this is the last slide I would have, which basically says that yes, we always have talked about as to what the spectrum would be. And because one of those dimensions, the first slide that I showed, one of the dimensions was as to how exactly do we get 10x bandwidth. And an easy way that we have gotten bandwidth is by moving farther and farther into larger frequencies, into smaller frequencies, larger frequencies, smaller wavelengths, primarily because we get spectral bandwidth, higher spectral bandwidth. Now that doesn't come for free. It is not that simple. Why hasn't millimeter wave taken off? Because I think it requires a certain densification of deployment, and that has its own challenge. So I think those practical challenges would be there, but yes, I kind of agree with a lot of speakers that mid-band, especially 7 to 24, because we've already gone to 6. I think going a little bit further would easily give us more bandwidth, but have the similar radio propagation characteristics, which would be important for us to use. And then again, we could move further and further out as we work on these. But I think because I'm running out of time, I leave it at that and maybe leave a minute or two for questions.